Hello and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. The date is November 12th, 2015. And today we are interviewing Eric Reeves. To give you a little background, many of you will know that last week, so about 7 days ago, November 5th, the LDS Church changed their Handbook 1 of Handbook of Instructions for their leadership, where, among other things, they added same-gender cohabitation or marriage as a mandatory criteria for apostasy, and they also implemented a policy that said that children of gay or lesbian people who are in same-gender relationships, either cohabitating or in a marriage, cannot receive a baby blessing, cannot be baptized, cannot receive the priesthood, and cannot serve missions unless they reach the age of 18, and then it requires First Presidency approval. Now, a week has gone by since that was released, and the entire sort of Mormon internet has exploded, and also it's become an international news story. I've personally spoken with New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Huffington Post, LA Times. Like, it's a big, big story. And so, there's a lot of things that we've done to try and be a part of this. We did a review of these policy changes on Mormon Stories last Friday, and we released that. Over the weekend, we've started putting together a website called sufferthelittlechildren.org, where we're assembling stories of people affected by these policies. And that website is now live, and we're proud of that. And what I now want to do, just today and tomorrow really, is release just a few interviews with people who have been affected by this policy. And the first person that I'm interviewing is Eric. And Eric is, what makes Eric's story maybe particularly intriguing, and maybe why some of you have tuned in, is that Eric is the son of Linda and Melvin Reeves, but his mother Linda is in the Relief Society General Presidency, I think is what it's called. So for those who aren't LDS, the LDS has three women who sort of stand at the head of their entire Relief Society organization of women all throughout the church. And Linda Reeves is in that presidency. She is first counselor. No, sorry. She's second counselor in the Relief Society General Presidency. And so Eric, we're going to get into this, but Eric felt strongly about wanting to talk about these issues, fully aware that his mom is in a high-profile position with the church, and that neither he nor I have any particular interest in being exploitative of this situation. But something about Eric's situation made him want to reach out to me and see what we could do. So with that big old lengthy introduction, Eric Reeves, welcome to Mormon Stories Podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Now, let's just begin. Tell us just a bit about, just at a really high level, you, are you single? Are you married? Or, where do you live? And just sort of tell us just a bit about you at a high level right now.
Yeah, I am single. I currently live, meaning I'm not married. I currently live in New York City. Was born in the Los Angeles area and lived there until just before my teenage years, when our family moved to the Salt Lake area. Been back in the California region again since then. I served a mission in Nicaragua, 2004 to 2006, and ended up out here in the city after school.
In New York City?
Correct.
Okay. And you're one of how many siblings?
It's a big family. I am one of 13 children. Wow. I fall almost in the middle. I'm number 8. And 8 girls, 5 boys. It's a very uh, great family. I love every one of them a lot. And everyone's married but me. And, um,
Wow.
but yeah, it's a great family.
And I don't know if this is an inappropriate question, but are all the children biological or some adopted?
All biological, all from my mother and father.
Wow. That's in 2015, that's sort of remarkable.
Yeah, even within the Mormon world,
Yeah,
it's quite an exception.
that's amazing. Okay. So what I want to do is talk, just talk a little bit about your background and your family, just to give us a sense for your upbringing and who you are. And then we'll go to what sort of what led to you. We'll talk a little bit about what it's like to have your mom be called to such a calling and how that happens and what that's like. And then we'll talk a little bit about your journey and what would lead to you feeling strongly about this issue to the point where you'd want to talk about it. And then we're going to actually talk about, you have a lot of thoughts about this policy, specifically to the attempts that Elder Christofferson made to sort of connect this to polygamy. So we'll talk about your thoughts on all of that. And then we'll end with sort of your final thoughts. Does that sound all right?
That sounds good. So, yeah, my family obviously has been very, or maybe not obviously, but they have been very strong in the church for at least, well, several generations. If you follow one line on, both sides, and some more recent converts back a generation or two on both sides. Several family members have been in leadership positions, and I only mention this, mostly in an attempt to show that, I don't think that we should use excuses to speak out on this issue. I think it's important that we voice our opinions. As you mentioned, I certainly don't want to exploit my mother's position in any way. But I obviously realize that as a matter of fact, it is something that's significant and relevant to the issue at hand. We've all been very involved in the church. There's been several callings and bishoprics.
Let me ask you real quick. Where'd your parents grow up?
They grew up in Southern California.
Both of them?
Yes. Yeah, Southern California. Still have family spread out between California, Utah, Idaho, Colorado, different places.
Did they go to BYU, or what did they do for school, your mom and dad?
They did. They attended Brigham Young University. I attended BYU for a few years. Almost everybody in my family spent some time at BYU.
Okay. So your parents met. They did or didn't meet at BYU?
They had met beforehand.
Okay.
My father served a mission, and strong Mormon family through and through.
And so, what's your dad's profession, if you don't mind? What is?
He's done several different things. Several different things. Sometimes self-employed, sometimes not. And my mother, obviously, with 13 kids, was pretty busy at home. She had a full-time job plus a lot, just dealing with that. So, again, last thing I think I'd want to say about this is just that, just to make it perfectly clear that my mother is a wonderful person. I know it sounds cliche, but she's not only the best woman that I know, but she's the best person that I know. And I did reach out to her and let her know that I had gotten to a point where I just felt like I couldn't stay silent on this issue any longer, and that I wasn't going to remain anonymous. And that's for a specific reason, which is we can't remain anonymous on this anymore. It's gotten to a level that I think it's imperative that there be discussion, that even if your views are opposing views, especially if they're opposing views, we need to speak up. I've said to several people that, I've long had a personal policy that I wouldn't ever let my personal beliefs get in the way of my family and relationships with my friends. But now it's gotten to a point where that trade-off just isn't worth it to me anymore. I certainly don't want any fallout with anybody, and I know that lots of members of the church feel this way. I would, and I don't see any reason why there has to be fallout. It's just, we need to be honest, we need to be open, we need to be genuine, and if that's the case, let's talk. And again, I expressed these things to my mother, and again, just for the sake of clarity, I'm obviously not speaking on her behalf in any way whatsoever. Everything that I'll share are my personal views. But I will point out that she has been, extraordinary in the literal sense of the word when it comes to dealing with my position on certain things. We've had heart-to-heart conversations at different points, and she's always been exceptional when it comes to understanding and being loving. And I think that she is, in many ways, an exemplary member of the church and leader in the church. And that's something that not everybody in the church has. Regardless of any family member positions.
That's great. That's great. So how does it, and this will just be kind of a quick line of questioning, and then we'll just get to your journey itself. I just want to,
Sure.
So, I was raised in the church, and my mom served in various callings, but never did I envision that my mom would ever be called into the General Relief Society board. Are there, and a lot of times there's sort of a feeling that a lot of the people that reach the status of sort of general authority in the church, it's because they have deep family or friend connections, sort of relationships with other general authorities, and that's, very much how it happens. To what extent is that relevant to your situation, or not? And how does it happen that a woman gets called into the general presidency? Do you have any idea how that works?
Going from California to Utah is an interesting transition in several ways. But we ended up at a place in Utah that has several prominent members of the church, great people. I mean, that ward that I was in was amazing, still is amazing. So many good people that are there.
Like somewhere in Salt Lake. You don't have to tell me the area, but just kind of
bountiful suburb of Salt Lake, and several impressive people in every area of life, not just in the church, but in politics and business and every area of life. And it was a great environment to grow up in and spend my teenage years in. But yeah, I do know personally, I had friends who had parents or grandparents that were general authorities. It has been interesting, mostly since then, actually, to see that several of these families do know each other. I wouldn't, we don't have to go too far into that, but for whatever the reason, I think that my father did serve as a mission president in Southern California after we lived in Salt Lake for quite a while, and then in any case, my mother's merits certainly stand on their own. But it is interesting to see those relationships, and like I said, great people all around. Again, at the risk of being repetitive, I would just state that I hope that none of those relationships change. But that concern is obviously something that's very familiar to members of the church. Particularly when you start to have certain views that don't fall in line with either the teachings or the policies of the church. Like I said, so many of us, most of us, would rather remain silent than disrupt any of those relationships that mean so much to us. And so again, the only reason that I think it is significant to point out some of these relationships is because I honestly would like other people who I know that have ties to immediate ties to people very high up in the church who may share similar views or may not be completely on board with what's happening. I hope that in some way, even if it's just one or two or a handful of them, that this might encourage others to speak out. Um, because, we have that luxury to either remain silent or to be vocal. What this new policy does, one of the reasons why, in my opinion, it's so dangerous is because there's been a whole group of people that's been identified that doesn't have the option of remaining silent unless it means completely denying a very fundamental part of their nature and not expressing their sexuality. That is now the only option if you would like to remain in good standing in the church. Literally the only option. And so I think it's, as I said, imperative that those of us that do have the luxury of either remaining silent or speaking up, I think it's imperative that we place ourselves in that same category. I mean, that's where it's gone, and we need to recognize that, and I think that obviously many people have and are doing something about it.
No, I think it's super courageous, and I know a lot of people in positions of power and influence, or related to people in positions of power and influence, who just are terrified to speak openly and honest. And I don't judge them. I can see why, but I can also understand how courageous I think it is that you're willing to do that. Let me just ask you, when your mom was called, I'm guessing that maybe you wouldn't describe yourself as sort of a Orthodox believing Mormon at this point, right?
Myself personally, no.
Yeah.
I am pretty much the exception when it comes to that in my immediate family. Not entirely, but I won't get into that either. But yeah, I have for a few years now held certain views that, like I said, it's a very strange realization when you first acknowledge that if you were to be vocal, I mean, you'll understand this as well as anybody. As soon as you have any views that would jeopardize your membership status were you to be vocal, you're suddenly subjected to this strange dual life, and you still feel the same way that you've always felt about the people that are around you, but this reality comes crashing down on you that you are, at least in your own mind, a black sheep. And on that note, this what I would call a crisis that the church is undergoing right now is a good opportunity to be honest about a lot of these things that have been the case for years and decades, if not for the entire history of the church. And it's a good opportunity for us to come out and speak openly about several of these things. And we owe it to the group that is now being targeted specifically.
Sure. So knowing that you're not Orthodox in your belief, I'm just curious if that started happening before your mom was called into the presidency, or during, or after, and what that's.
It was before.
Okay, so I'm wondering what that's like to be struggling, and then to have a member of your family called into a position like that. Is that weird? Is it hard? Because I'm sure all the eyes are on your family as, like, I don't want to say royalty, but like people of status in the church.
It's certainly made me, I think, less inclined to be open with others or to speak publicly than I would have otherwise been. Yeah. Although that pressure certainly exists no matter who you are in the church.
Yeah.
It wasn't terribly surprising or shocking, and for me, when she was called, I think that the part of that had to do with the fact that, like I said, I did know a lot of people who had relatives that were in significant positions in the church, and another part of it was that my mom is just such a wonderful person, that in that sense it wasn't surprising either.
Yeah, but was it weird for you to be struggling with your faith?
I'll tell you what was weird was that when I first had a faith crisis, I don't even like calling it a faith crisis. When I had a paradigm shift, or when my beliefs shifted, I was living in the mission home, and that
Oh,
I
wow.
mean, I was going out with the missionaries 2 or 3 times a week.
Holy moly.
We were baptizing a lot of people. I made several friends in that singles ward. Um, it was a great time of life. I was heavily involved in the church, 100%. I'd been off of my mission, I suppose, at that point, maybe a couple of years, and like I said, I was teaching with the missionaries several times a week, and it was a very interesting thing. I didn't so much plan on talking about this, but I guess it's as relevant as anything else. Uh, Ultimately, what it was is I studied several things, history and philosophy and so on. That I was never afraid to question. I was 100% convinced that any question would ultimately come back to the underlying truth that the gospel is true, the church is true. Um, and so that gave me a certain level of confidence in pursuing any question that I was curious about. Um, and I never really had a, a fundamental crisis of faith. There did come a point, maybe a year beforehand, in which it got pretty close, and there were a lot of things that didn't seem to add up. Um, and yet again, I said, you know what? It's always come back to the same thing. I had a very strong testimony of the Book of Mormon. I had a very strong and powerful experience with the Book of Mormon, with Moroni's promise specifically. Um, so that was all very familiar to me. And it was something that I talked about a lot. It was the basis of my testimony. It's what I always came back to. And, so again, that year period prior, I sort of doubled down, as so many of us do. And, I had a personal goal for most of my life since I shouldn't say most of my life, most of my adult life, of reading the scriptures at least an hour a day. Um, I prided myself in being well versed in both the Bible and the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants and so on. Um, and so in that sense, it was completely out of nowhere, um, for me as much as anyone else. But at the same time, fortunately for me, it wasn't such a difficult thing personally when I underwent this large shift in fundamental beliefs. Um, and for a lot of people, it obviously is. So it wasn't met with sadness. It wasn't met with depression. It wasn't met with fear until I started to realize the social implications of what had happened. Um,
Was
and
it church history stuff like, polygamy and all
it
that?
actually wasn't. It actually had very little to do with church history. And part of the reason was I had a very good church history teacher while I was at BYU, uh, Bruce Stewart, who teaches or taught at the Salt Lake Center. He's a great, great guy. He's a great historian. He's probably retired now, but he was extremely open. Is more open than anyone else I've ever seen in the church who was active. He was very open with the historical problems in the church. He stated from day one that he cited statistics about people who leave the church and how by far the biggest reason is historical problems. And so he had his mission as an educator was to, among other things, was to prepare students to deal with these historical problems. Um, and so, I know several people who attended that class as well. They didn't all end up where I did. So I don't cite that as an impetus for the change eventually. It certainly opened me up to the true nature of the church, that's for sure, but I think in a good way. I think that a lot of members, I wish all members could undergo something like that, even if they stay 100% active, because again, it wasn't what got me out. I was actually more or less bulletproof when it came to history, because since this big change, this transformation in beliefs, there are other things I found out about church history that are certainly troubling, but again, at the time, I was more or less bulletproof. Um, and then, as it relates specifically to this issue, LGBT issues. I canvassed in California for Prop 8. Um, I I did have
What does that mean? What
certain
does that mean to canvas?
went door to door knocking, asking people to how they were voting, encouraging them to vote in favor of Prop 8. As most of us are aware, that's where the church's involvement against gay rights became gained mass public awareness in the aftermath of that. Um, and I did have sort of nuanced reasons for why I didn't necessarily want to be doing that, but I unfortunately can't say that I was in favor of gay marriage at the time. I wasn't. And part of the reason this is a problem, I think, in the church is that I didn't know anyone who was openly gay. Literally not a single person. Here I am, young 20s. I didn't know a single person who was openly gay. I obviously knew gay people. Looking back, not to suggest that I'm speaking of any individuals, but obviously in my life, as anybody must, I knew gay people, but they weren't open. They couldn't be. And it wasn't until I came to New York City, I have several gay friends now, and you realize, wow, these are great people. This is a part of their identity that is real as anything else. And those are things you can't, it's difficult to come to that realization when you are in the bubble of the church. And even though I was in California at the time, going back and forth from school, you're still if you're in the Mormon context, it's very easy to block out a lot of things that are going on, including legitimate intellectual progress on certain issues, including this one. It just, from afar, from the inside the church, it looks like it's chaotic, random, moral relativity that has no rhyme or reason to it. But that's not the case. There's sound historical and intellectual progress that's occurred. But this schism has grown wider and wider. I was encouraged that the church was starting to actually acknowledge that homosexuality might be inherent to some extent. There's several, there was an enzyme piece, I believe, by Elder Holland that was more or less acknowledging of that, if I'm not mistaken, and it was filled with language of love and a call to be more, to treat these people better, right? And, Boyd K. Packer's talk where he suggested that God wouldn't create people with gay tendencies, that was edited before it was printed to remove that mindset. So there were these promising signs, because that is what it comes down to in my mind. Not just in the church, but that was the wider struggle in the nation, was acknowledging, because until you acknowledge that it is inherent to whatever extent, until you acknowledge that it doesn't seem like a rights issue. And that's how it was for me. It was, no, this is an argument about lifestyle and what the best lifestyle is. But that, of course, isn't true. It's an argument about rights. It is, and it's, so again, that was encouraging. This policy, however, seems so retrogressive. I mean, it's institutionalized. I don't know how to put it, except that it's institutionalized bigotry. I mean, it is. It's extremely discriminatory. In fact, it's the most discriminatory policy the church could have implemented, short of saying, even if you're not acting on your tendencies, if you are gay, you're not welcome in the church.
Yeah.
It's the most discriminatory thing possible short of that.
Now, let me just really quick, I want to jump into that. I love stories, and there's a cliffhanger.
Sure.
Are you comfortable talking about, and you could even do it in a minute or two, just what did lead to that transformation for you if it wasn't history?
Sure. It was mostly philosophy. I started studying philosophy, and I know that sounds bad to any member of the church listening, but
philosophies of men.
Right. I love philosophy. It was amazing, and so much of what we believe, or even what I believed as a member of the church, I realized had come from our philosophical heritage in the West, and it was very strange to realize that. You read enough of these books that are dedicated to philosophy, and you start to realize, okay, that talk that person gave was 80% Aristotelian ideas, and it was 20%, 15% biblical ideas and 5% Book of Mormon, or whatever, and those are things that you don't pick up on typically, but and it obviously doesn't just apply to the church; it applies to politics, it applies to anything else in our culture. Um, and it was more or less philosophical ideas that, like I said, had initially started me on a path of wondering if there wasn't more to this than just the church is true, absolutely, and the only truth. But ultimately, it was actually studying the Bible in Hebrew that did it for me. I had a couple classes. I took Hebrew for a couple semesters, and then I took a class on the Torah. I took a class on the Tanakh more generally. And when I started to study the scriptures in its original language, that was so mind-opening. And at first, just amazing from the standpoint of fortifying my testimony and enriching my testimony. You could verses that you were familiar with for your entire life suddenly took on new meaning, in a good way. And again, at this point, I'm thinking there's nothing I could possibly inquire about that would lead me away ultimately from the conclusion that the church is true, even if there seemed to be detours along the way. And of course, why would studying the scriptures in its original language lead to any other conclusion? But that is, if I had to pinpoint any one thing, it would be that. And we could talk for hours about that, and maybe we will sometime.
So stuff like theodicy and the problem of evil, stuff like
broad questions like
truth?
That, but more specific linguistic issues. Because of course, the underlying premise of the church is that the original truth of God has been restored, and it's the same truth that was had in the time of Christ, and it was the same truth that was had prior to that. And so, if there are issues that are ingrained, that are exposed by the very language that the scriptures were written in, and it's not that somebody changed it later, it's not that, because there are several ancient civilizations or cultures that had similar things written into the language itself that preclude the possibility of, they didn't have the same worldview we have, and there's no way to get around it. And when I came to that realization, that was, it was like, it literally did come down to one night, by the way, where the million questions I had, which is usually described as people talk about putting things on the shelf that you can't reconcile. And eventually it gets so heavy it buckles under its own weight and the shelf comes crashing down. It wasn't like that for me. It was more, I had a million different questions that were on standby and required a million different answers in order to conclude that the church was absolutely 100% true. Or there was one answer that explained everything, and that's that the church wasn't 100% absolutely true. And so when it finally all clicked, it was as though, the analogy I use, it was as though I had crossed a huge chasm, like I had built a bridge, and all I knew was that I was asking different questions and I was looking for different answers, and suddenly I looked down and realized I was on the other side of this chasm, and it was just one small step off of that bridge, and like I said, it wasn't until later that I realized what that chasm meant in my personal life, as far as my relationships with other people were concerned. And unfortunately, I chose silence rather than deal with the reality that I was on a different page. But it came down to one night and one moment. It was New Year's Eve. I was in the mission home, and
what year?
Let's see. It would have been. It was either 2010 or 2009, I believe.
Okay.
but I remember
So 5 or 6 years ago.
yeah, I was answering, there was a question. I was actually turning in something late for that semester in school, and one of the questions was, it was about Galileo and having been under house arrest by the Catholic Church. And it was some question that was effectively, why, what more or less, what does that scenario tell you about science and religion? And it wasn't such a loaded question as, I can't remember what exactly the wording was, but it was like, and that was something I'd considered 100 times, right? But for some reason, right then, I thought, you know what? For people in that context, in that time, they were in the true church, and it was 100% absolutely true. And they were trying to grapple with new information, and they were trying to fit that into their framework and how they viewed the world, and it didn't fit. And I realized I was no exception, that my insistence that I had the truth was no different from theirs. And for whatever reason, who knows, there's a billion factors that go into this, but it just clicked in one moment.
And for you, it wasn't some awful, terrible, sad, depressing thing. It was what?
No, I
What
said,
was it?
oh, if anything, it was just a moment of relief, but the next day I felt fine.
It's like, oh,
Yeah, I went and hung out with my friends and family that were over celebrating New Year's, but just, and I was the same person. And that's another thing that's hard to realize when you're in the church and you're active and you've been active your whole life, is that inactive people are not different. They haven't changed. Their views have changed, and maybe their lifestyle has changed because their views have changed, but they're the same person. And one of the great things about the time that we're in, of course, is the internet and how open communication is now. And whereas for decades it was so easy just to cut people off from the church and that was it, rather than deal with any issues that people might have, any legitimate issues, just cut them off and move on. And that, of course, is what we're seeing now, but on such a huge scale, it is almost unbelievable. But now we can't be ignored. We're all on the same websites. We're all using the same social media. We're in close contact with our friends and family, even if you're halfway across the world. And that, of course, is a game changer, not just for the church, but for society as a whole. And that's what is most encouraging for me now. And we talked about how my position places me in some sort of a unique circumstance, but really it's, it doesn't matter. The point is we all need to speak out. We are all in a unique position to change the way that things work.
sure.
And I think it'll happen.
So, and this will tie into the LGBT theme. After you realized you didn't believe anymore, but then you thought about the familial and the social implications. Did you remain in the closet for a period of time?
Yes.
Was there what was that like? Was there a coming out for you, and what was that like? And especially, what was that like with a mom as a member of the General Relief Society presidency? That's a lot of questions, but just take us through
Sure.
that if you can.
Yeah, it became harder and harder every day. And that reality became more and more clear. Like the next time the missionaries wanted to go out, right? The next time it was my turn to testify. The next time that I was asked to confirm somebody I'd helped to convert. I mean, it was so hard because I consider myself an honest person, even, obviously even still. But here, somebody who cares about me and cares about, that we've forged a relationship with is asking me to confirm them, and I'm supposed to bless them, and these kind of day-to-day scenarios as a member of the church are all of a sudden, I felt like I wasn't being honest, right? That's where the dual life comes in, and you would like to be able to continue to do all of those things, but you can't do them and be honest at the same time. So I actually told initially my father. I let him know pretty early on because I didn't feel comfortable not telling them. it was, and again, to their credit, my parents have been great in general, just great. So much better than so many horror stories that you hear about people coming out to their families with their beliefs. But believe it or not, I had transferred schools, and so I wasn't at BYU any longer. I actually went back to BYU for a spring semester because it was my quickest way. That was actually going to BYU in Provo was placing me in a less pressurized situation when it came to the church, and gave me just a little time to kind of reevaluate everything. Because again, all these people I loved going out with the missionaries. I loved teaching. I was very involved in that ward. And it was from one moment to the next, it all changed. And, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So you had to take some time to process it. Eventually you came out. Both your parents were loving and supportive.
Yeah, of course, they, again, as so many are all too familiar, it enters this new phase where some people that I was open with responded negatively. I had a very good friend who I had met on the mission, not my mission, but the mission there in California. I had a very good friend say to me that they thought my life would become so miserable I'd have to come back to the church. And it's so strange because after having been a lifelong member of the church, you can relate to their mindset. You know what they're saying and you know why they're saying it. And yet the reality was, here I was in my early 20s, huge decisions in my life, now bigger than ever because of the transformation I just underwent. And somebody who I would have hoped to be one of my biggest points of support was telling me they hope my life becomes miserable so that I come back to the church. When you're trying to make educational decisions and career decisions and are just going through the difficult things in life that anybody goes through, whether you're a member or not, and you're getting that kind of response to people you're trying to open up to, you start to close off and you become more reclusive, and speaking out becomes scary, and even the people who responded relatively positively, it changes everything. Even if you never talk about how it changes, you feel it. It's unspoken. Something that I pointed out once to my mother was, after years had passed, 2 or 3 years, I said, do you know why I don't believe the same things I once believed? And she had to think about it. She said, I guess I don't. And I'm not throwing my mother under the bus. I'm just trying to show that even those who are extremely loving and even those who you continue to have good relationships with, they don't really, it's very hard for members of the church to understand how difficult it is to be inactive. Or rather how difficult it is to have a change of beliefs in the middle of a Mormon life. It changes everything. And I think that the leaders don't understand that to the extent that I wish they did. And so there are several things that people say. There are cultural mindsets that are extremely difficult to root out because, again, it went unquestioned for so long. It simply was more efficient to deal with dissenters in a certain way that now is impossible, at least certainly to the same extent.
Yeah. So eventually you come out and you're sort of graduating from school and becoming a professional. So tell us, and you've already said that this policy really upset you, but let's jump into the policy and just talk about kind of how you heard about it, how it hit you, and what was it about it that led you to feel like you needed to talk about it openly?
Well, I've gone through varying degrees of participation or just, lurking, as it's called, on online forums, particularly on Reddit. And so I actually, and I haven't been as active as times past, but I saw, it wasn't until late in the night I should have been in bed already, and all of a sudden I see this, the leak, which actually I believe the policy, it's dated November 3rd, and it's effective immediately. So it was actually 1 or 2 days later that somebody leaked it, and I didn't sleep. I didn't sleep. It
Oh
was
no.
it was unbelievable. I mean, it's like nobody was expecting the church to permit gay marriage within the temples anytime soon, for example, right? Nobody was expecting that. But I don't think anybody expected this level of discrimination. I mean, this is so extreme. As I said before, it's almost the most extreme thing the church could have done. And it is the most extreme thing they could have done as far as people acting on their sexuality. And so it was just unbelievable. I was reading up on it as much as I could. There wasn't a lot of information at that time. I eagerly watched the next day Elder Christofferson's, interview with the public relations manager of the church, and I don't know what I was expecting per se, but the explanations that were given are just, well, we should go into them. They deserve to be picked apart because those are the explanations that members of the church are latching on to, those that are okay with the policy. They're taking them up hook, line, and sinker. But there are some critical problems with them, and that's what I'm eager to get into.
Well, let's do it. So
Okay.
how do you lead, and I'll ask questions as you go, but
Sure. Well, something that I think provides good context for what the policy actually means is looking at how membership works in the church. If you read the handbook, it states, we're all aware that doctrinally we become members of the church at baptism and confirmation. But for the purposes of statistics and reporting those statistics, the church actually counts anybody who's been blessed and named as what they call member of record, I believe is the term they use. So a membership record is created once you are named and blessed, even before you're baptized. Once you're 8 years old, you're expected to be baptized. If you are and you're confirmed, then you continue to be a child of record or a member of record. And there's a 1 year window until you're 9. And then between age 9 and 18, and I'm going into this because it's significant ultimately, but between age 9 and 18, if you're not baptized, you're no longer considered a member of record, and yet you nonetheless have a membership record. The handbook goes into these little nuances. But the point is that what this new policy accomplishes is that you cannot be counted on the rolls of the church in any way whatsoever if you have any connection whatsoever to a gay family, to a same-sex cohabiting or married relationship. And that's ultimately what this is about, I think. I mean, that's clearly what it's about effectively, is that the church is refusing to officially acknowledge in any way whatsoever this newly legally sanctioned family in America, which is a family with homosexual parents, same-sex family or the same gender cohabiting or married relationship as the handbook refers to it. That's what this is about. They either don't want to count as member, these children, or they don't want any overlap whatsoever between church membership and gay families. That's what this is ultimately about.
and I I heard reference to an interview on Gina Colvin's The Thoughtful Faith podcast. She interviewed an attorney who does a lot with family law, and maybe you've thought about this, maybe you haven't, maybe you'll see it fitting or not. But his theory is that if children are, I don't know, either in full custody or joint custody in a divorce, and those children are receiving messages that sort of, teach hate or, bigotry towards one set of parents, what this person theorizes is that leaves possibly the church open for lawsuits, because in some way, if they're teaching their kids, if they're teaching these children to potentially hate their parents, that can get on the wrong side of the law and lead to really messy problems with how divorce and ownership and custody and split families go. And so
Right.
if they're never members to begin with, if they're never baptized, if they're not even allowed to be children of record, then a claim can never be made that the church is meddling unsafely with children in a way that can affect the parent-child relationship from a legal standpoint. So many people are saying, crazy, they don't even let the baby be blessed. Like, that's actually explicitly part of the problem, because as soon as they let the baby be blessed, then there's a record, like you say, and then that can be used in a court of law to say that the church is teaching its own members, the children, to hate their parents in some way. Now, that was a big, long ramble. Tell me if you think that fits into some of your concerns.
I had heard somebody suggest something similar to that. It was more or less that if a judge was making a decision on custody, they'd be less inclined. It's safer if there's this stringent separation. The reason why I don't think that would be the case is, in my opinion, any judge who has their head on straight would look at this and say, wow, you shouldn't, if anything, that will be extremely detrimental for this child, for them to be associating. It doesn't help the church's case to exclude these children, is ultimately what I'm getting at.
Okay.
I don't know how that helps the church's case, but it certainly, to whatever extent it has legal implications, which is usually what this all comes down to when it comes to the church with almost anything. I don't know. I'm not sure. I've gone back and forth over the last few days as I've analyzed the specific language in the policies and looked at what Elder Christofferson said. There's no doubt in my mind, though, that hiding behind the children is very disingenuous, and it's not, and that becomes blatantly obvious when you compare the policy to the church's policy on polygamy, which of course was the next justification that was given for this, that the church has long had a restrictive policy regarding polygamous families that is analogous to this. I don't know why the church would want to draw attention to this comparison, but since they did, it's worth looking at. And, this is a long response to your question, but things that I wanted to get into anyway. When you look at the church's policy on children from polygamous relationships, is how they term it, they actually separate it between adults and minors. There's a section dedicated to adults from these relationships and minors from these relationships. And the exceptions that are provided for adults are rather lenient. The exceptions for minors are understandably stricter, but there are exceptions for minors. That's, if you look at their bullet point, their numerical outline of what needs to happen in order for a minor to be baptized. The condition is they can't live in that home anymore. They have to disavow the relationship, and they can be baptized if that's the case, if they receive approval from the First Presidency. Now, something that is interesting and of utmost importance is acknowledging that the policy on polygamy does not say that these children can't receive a name and a blessing. It doesn't say that. The policy on these same gender families is that any child that's coming from these families explicitly cannot be named or blessed. The church makes no note of that for children from polygamous families. So in other words, they are okay with these children receiving membership records. They're not okay with children from same-gender families or families with same-gender parents receiving a membership record. What they've done essentially is taken the exceptions for minors from polygamous families, made them more strict, and applied them to adults coming from same-gender families. And that's where the language surrounding children becomes disingenuous for me. It would have been very simple to simply state there are no exceptions for minors when it comes to same-gender relationships. Instead, it says exceptions for children are as follows, and the last stipulation is that the child be of legal age. In other words, not a child.
Right.
So
children have nothing to do with this.
Right. Except that they are banned outright. No child coming from a same-sex relationship has any place in the church whatsoever. An adult, and this is where this is where it's unbelievable. For an adult, I mean, we're all aware. This part is what's getting the attention, right? Is that you have to be 18, and you have to disavow your parents' relationship, and then, with approval from the First Presidency, you can be baptized. You can never be blessed or named under any circumstance. You can never be baptized before you're 18 under any circumstance. But the real kicker is that if either of your parents have at any point in time lived in either a cohabiting or married same-sex relationship, you cannot be baptized. You cannot be named and blessed you can't be named and blessed at all. And you can't be baptized until you're 18. So, according to the language right now in the approved policy that the church has verified, if your mother, for example, cohabited with another female for a year in college, right, you can't be baptized. Even if she disavowed her own relationship and has been living in a straight relationship ever since and is an active member in good standing, you can't be baptized before you're 18, according to the way the policy stands. And so that's where, to me, that's where it really gets crazy, because to whatever extent the church might have been willing to compromise on any of the hypothetical situations that have already started to arise in reality, joint custody, and everything else that could possibly happen. I mean, they took, as I said before, the most discriminatory policy they could have possibly done. And it's in response to and despite what has happened in wider society, the level of acceptance. There's plenty to get into there too, but anyway, some of that people are talking about, some of it I haven't seen written anywhere. But what this is really about is no member of a same-sex family is acknowledged by the church in any way whatsoever.
Yeah. Yeah, they just want, I don't know how to interpret it as anything other than they just want them gone. They want gay people out of the church, unless they're mixed orientation marriages or celibate, and they want their children out. And I have to think that in addition to whatever legal liabilities they may be concerned about, there's also an extent to which proximity leads to sympathy. So, if you look at the early 60s and the civil rights movement, what was causing riots? It was black students wanting to sit at a lunch counter in Nashville. That caused riots. It was a black student, a black man wanting to attend the University of Mississippi. That caused riots. It was Rosa Parks wanting to sit in the front of the bus just with other white people. And I think when bigotry is involved, it's an otherizing of a group of people, saying they're lesser than, they're bad, they're sinful, they're dark, inferior, and you have to keep them at a distance. You probably know this from philosophy. You have to keep them at a distance to be able to otherize them, because if you bring them close and sit next to them and look them in the eye and talk to them and learn their story, then all of a sudden you get emotionally connected with them. You feel sympathy for them. You understand their point of view. And just like you had said, you had grown up how many years never knowing a gay person really openly, an outwardly gay person.
Right.
And I think the church wants to keep it that way, because if they don't,
absolutely,
then we're having sympathy for their children. Then we're seeing that their children are healthy and happy in a gay marriage or in a lesbian marriage. We're seeing that the gay couple's happy or the lesbian couple's happy, or is at least as healthy and happy as the rest of us. And all of a sudden, everyone's going to say why the policy, why the exclusion, why the plan of salvation leaves these people out. Why can't they go to the temple? Why can't they have callings? And then all of a sudden, everybody's going to question the plan of salvation, and they're going to question the authority of the brethren. Are they really speaking for God? And so, and I heard this word on an interview in the Thoughtful Faith podcast. This becomes an existential threat to the church because it unravels the plan of salvation and prophetic authority if we come to love these children and same-sex parents too much. What do you think about that?
Right, but not. I totally agree. However, it's important to acknowledge that it not necessarily would it have to pull the entire plan of salvation into question. There was so much room for compromise here, and that's gone. I mean, if they had just left the policy how it was, which was leaving it up to the discretion of local authorities to do with gay members what they thought fit, that I thought that's pretty reasonable. We can't expect the church to just comply 100% with the rest of the world, but why not leave it like that? That way, bishops and congregations that are more friendly and compassionate towards gay people could have, there could have been a healthy environment for these people to coexist in the church. And there are several congregations, I'm sure, where this will be so much more difficult than if you're in Bountiful, Utah, right? And so for the church to say everybody has to fall in line with this new policy, given the strictness of it, the extremeness of it is just appalling. And again, one of the reasons I want to speak up is to help remove the excuse that, the inevitable fallout, right, that people are trying to avoid. Bishops should do what they think is best here. You drew the obvious parallel to the civil rights movement, which, by the way, to add to your analysis of why people eventually opened up to better race relations, a big part of it was television. A big part of it was the news, the broadcast, seeing what was happening to these people, particularly in the South. And people in the West and people in the North, it was unbelievable to see what was happening. Most people had no idea. If you're in the South, of course, you were seeing it firsthand. But people had no idea the kind of things that were happening. And to take the parallel further, and specifically as it regards the church, we had more or less begun to disavow, at least tacitly, so many we stopped talking about the racist doctrines as much as we used to. If you compare the rhetoric in the 1850s versus the 1950s, it's two different worlds, right? But the policy was in place already. And after the Civil Rights Act, which required places of public accommodation and schools and places of employment to desegregate and not discriminate, but it didn't require religious groups to do so. And so even after the Civil Rights Movement, even though the church stopped with most of the racist doctrine and teachings, it wasn't until 1978, 14 years later, that they finally said, okay, essentially, we'll desegregate the temple, is what happened. Black families were banned from participation in the temple. We focus on blacks in the priesthood is the term that we always use. We focus on the men not being able to receive the priesthood. That's misleading because to most people in the world, the priesthood means the leadership hierarchy, and they don't understand that in the Mormon church, every male is expected to hold the priesthood. So banning the men from the priesthood was something more significant than not letting them into some kind of seminary or some kind of institutional leadership organization. And but yeah, basically what happened is that after the Civil Rights Act, the church still held on to their right, their religious right as they saw it, and as many people saw it in the country at the time, to still discriminate within their organization. So the parallel now is is very accurate. But this is the difference. Instead of slowly disavowing those teachings, in the case of homosexuality, the church has addressed it more. They have spoken out against homosexuality more. As the country is changing in their views on the issue, the church is becoming more and more entrenched. That was not the case with race relations.
Yeah, by adding same-gender cohabitation or marriage to the list of apostasy that's required, rape and incest and murder does not require a disciplinary council.
Yeah. By the way, sorry.
But same-sex marriage does.
Yeah. And on that point, by the way, real quick, the handbook distinguishes between cohabitation and marriage. They're forced to acknowledge marriage now because it's an actual federally sanctioned legal term, right? But they don't do that with polygamy. They refer to all polygamous relationships as marriages, even though they're not legally sanctioned. And so the language is more lenient toward polygamous families. The policy itself is more lenient toward polygamous families. And that's why anytime that anybody speaks up in person or online and tries to use polygamy and the church's policy on polygamy as precedents and as an analogy needs to be called out. And the conversation should go there, but it should be, why are gay families under so much more of an attack than polygamous families, right? Not to mention, of course, that it's disingenuous to make the comparison by the church, because the stance on polygamy was in response to social pressure to comply with the wider standards in society. This is the complete opposite. And so just like I was saying we had moved away from the racist rhetoric in general before the lifting the ban. Here it's increased in the case of homosexuality, and it comes the ban itself has come at a time when the rest of society has accepted the homosexual family. In other words, it's akin to the church first implementing their ban on black families from the temple after and in response to the Civil Rights Act. I mean, think about how embarrassing the church's record on race relations already is. Could you imagine how much worse it would have been if they were the most active and staunch group fighting against civil rights? Instead of becoming silent on the issue and eventually lifting the ban, what if they were at the forefront and placing themselves at the forefront of the fight against civil rights and had banned black people from the temples after the federal government accepted non-discrimination? That's what we're dealing with now. It's on that level. It's of that nature. And when we look back at this time, it will look that bad. It looks that bad now to me. And, this is extremely significant historically. And what's the social impetus for it? There's no doctrinal or social justification or motivation for it to be this stringent.
It's not in the Book of Mormon. It's not in the Doctrine and Covenants. It's not in the Pearl of Great Price. You can't find anything Jesus said about it.
Yeah. And you had made a point when we were discussing earlier. This is the opposite of the church's stance on heterosexuality, where sexual sin becomes less and less as you move toward marriage. Nothing's supposed to be happening outside of a monogamous marriage in today's church, a monogamous heterosexual marriage. With this policy, that's the worst thing you could do, is be married. If you're married to someone of the same gender, local authorities are obligated to subject you to a disciplinary council. If you're cohabiting, they should probably subject you to a disciplinary council. It's recommended by the handbook. If you're just hooking up with people, you're not even, you may not, that's still fornication, adultery, whatever else, but it's still viewed less seriously by the handbook than cohabitation, which is viewed less seriously as marriage.
So if a gay man is having indiscriminate, random, unsafe sex with anyone they can find at any day, time, or night, their child can still be baptized, still be confirmed,
Yep. They can still receive a name and a blessing.
And so that they're totally punishing the wrong type of behavior.
Yeah. They're condoning more reckless and irresponsible behavior.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
that's awful.
It is.
I
Yeah.
also just have to bring up that the church's policy regarding polygamy is that it may be in the United States they have had some policies about the children of polygamous people, receiving ordinances. But if you read the policy carefully, if and this has been true for years, if a child or a minor wants to be baptized in a foreign country where polygamy is legal, the policy actually allows for that. So it's another area where we're trying to draw a parallel that doesn't exist. In the United States,
And by the way, trying to draw that parallel makes the church look so much worse. I mean, the policy was bad enough. Now you're drawing attention to your stance on polygamy.
which the church caused, by the way. It was
Right.
the
Yeah,
brethren that got us into the mess
inviting
of
it.
polygamy. But I just want to make that point that we're trying to say we're treating kids in same gender marriages the same way we're treating kids in polygamous families. That's not true. In the Middle East, wherever there are Muslim countries, if a child or a minor wants to get baptized and they're from a polygamous family, they're allowed to now if polygamy is legal in that country.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the most discriminatory policy the church has ever had, period. Look at blacks for over a century. It was a terrible thing. It's an awful thing. But it was not this strict. You look at polygamy even now in today's church, it is not this strict. It's the most discriminatory policy the church has ever had.
Yeah, because the children of rapists and murderers and pedophiles can all still receive names and blessings and still be baptized.
Yeah. What about protecting those children?
And also, the children don't have to condemn the lifestyle of their cohabiting heterosexual parents, of their, murderous parents or whatever. None of that sort of condemning the lifestyle of the parent applies to any of those other sins.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah. And all of this, John, comes back to, as I said, a very long response to your question about legality issues. I think the answer is this is much more about politics than anything else. That's the only way that this scheme of getting married being the worst thing you could possibly do. It's because that is the most opposed thing you could do to the church's stance on this issue. And so it's not about the children. It's not about legal matters, which, I mean, it may be to some extent, but what it's really about, in my opinion, is the politics of it. The church, especially since 1993, when they kicked off, their involvement in Hawaii, in reaction to the Supreme Court of Hawaii saying that denying marriage licenses to same-sex couples was an act of discrimination, and that the state needed to legislate on the matter, and the church made a big push and formulated their political method, right, that they then applied in several other places, several other states. And so at least on a state level, I don't know if there's an entity that's been as active as the church in fighting against gay rights. And now that battle is lost, the church announced earlier this year its Fairness for All initiative, in which it's backing gay rights in areas of employment and housing, for example, in exchange for the right to discriminate within their own organization. And they're very open about this, and Christofferson did eventually get there in his interview. But in my opinion, that's what it really is. And the reason is that just in the same way that the church was wanting and actually was spearheading the movement against gay rights in America on a state level, they are now attempting to spearhead the movement of religious rights in the aftermath of the Supreme Court ruling in favor of recognizing same-sex marriage as a fundamental right. And so, again, the analogy with the civil rights era is poignant. I'll repeat it. It's as though if in the aftermath of the Civil Rights Act, the church said, okay, fine. You are forcing us and other people to accept blacks openly in our other institutions. Well, we have a religious right to discriminate against blacks in our religious institutions. That's what they're doing with homosexual rights. And it's appalling. It's inexcusable. And that's why, for me, it's gotten to a point where silence is tacit. It implicates you. If you are silent on this matter, you are condoning that level of bigotry, that level of discrimination. And so we have an obligation to speak out. We're all aware that thousands of people are and have been resigning over this. And that's certainly anyone's prerogative that feels that that's the best course of action. I would actually like to see people who are at that point not resign. People can do whatever they want, but I think it would be much more effective to say, if I'm unconcerned about where this heads for my own personal membership, I'm going to stand up for these other people who are being denied membership in any form in the church, and I'm going to voice my opinion, even at the risk of jeopardizing my own membership status, because they deserve it, and otherwise we are implicated in that discrimination. And so, rather than resign because you're embarrassed to be affiliated with the church, why not demand that things be done differently? Why not demand that things be done on your own terms? And if they want to get rid of every last one of us, so be it. But why not turn it into that witch hunt? Because here's the other thing, John, to provide a little more context, stuff that several of us are aware of. But in the same year that the church started to get heavily involved politically in Hawaii, Elder Packer gave that talk where he identified the gay and lesbian movement, as he called it, the feminist movement, and intellectuals, so-called scholars and intellectuals, as virtually the biggest threats to the church membership. He said threats to leading away the membership, and he referred to them. He said that he's citing those three groups in particular because they have already made progress in invading the church. In other words, what we are witnessing now is the culmination of more than a 2-decade-long campaign to eradicate these three groups from the church. In terms of feminism and intellectualism, the casualties have been isolated, they've been spread out, they've been seemingly random. You're one of those casualties.
Kate Kelly.
Yeah, Kate Kelly and the feminist group is one of those casualties. Well, all of us so-called scholars and intellectuals need to step up to the plate and say, come after me. Because now you have taken the gay and lesbian group, you've packaged them up, and you've excised them from the church. That's what the church is willing to do to get rid of these groups. I'm of that group of intellectuals that has certain positions on the church that I, up until now, have been willing to keep to myself because my family was that important to me. I no longer am willing to stay silent. And if I need to be boxed up and shipped out too, so be it. But I'm not going to walk away easy. I'm not going to resign because that's what they want. If every gay person walked away from the church right now, and if every person who supported them walked away from the church right now, their job's done. Their job is done. But if bishops have to subject gay families to excommunicative discipline, then why not all of us? Because we've been on that list for a long time, we've just been silent. And again, I'm getting repetitive, but that's why silence is no longer an option for me. And I'm going to speak out on several issues. This is just the beginning. But this is the most pressing one because of this new policy. And like I said, it shows what the church is capable of. It shows what they're willing to do. But whether they're willing to go after every last individual, I guess we'll see. But we shouldn't go down easy. I'm sorry to go off on a rant, but no matter what happens, no matter how we all come out on the other side of this, the church will never be the same. Because it will either have to be more stringent than it ever has been, literally, which is quite a thought by itself. But it's either going to have to be more stringent than it ever has been, or it's going to have to open itself up to more dialogue. It's going to have to open itself up to more deliberation before anything like this could ever happen again. And there's no better time than now. And so everybody who's opposed to this needs to step up. They need to say something. Many people already have, but I'm trying to reach out to other people, to everyone who has any degree of opposition to this. Because again, they've taken it to the extreme. You may fall on at any point between that extreme to absolute full acceptance. But if you are in any way opposed, you should be speaking out, because otherwise you are implicated in this. And that really is the situation we're in right now as members.
So what some people, I have a friend that wrote a letter or an email to his bishop and just said, I understand that the brethren have taken this position, that this is now policy, and I'm telling you, I disagree with the brethren, and if that makes me an apostate, then I want you to
do what you have to
do. Is that something that you're considering?
I don't think it has to be that direct. I mean, that's great if he feels, if that's how you want to take your stand and make your voice known, that's great. But for me, it's speak up on social media. When somebody compares this to polygamy, point out how much worse it is. When somebody says that this is about children, point out how that's misleading. Take all the excuses that have been given for this and turn them on their head, because the truth is that they are not valid excuses. The only valid excuse was the fairness for all comment, right? That's what's happening. The church is reserving the right to discriminate in almost the most heinous way that it can. That's what this is. And I think that they're taking this stance on behalf of, as they see it, the rest of the religious community. But again, the terrible thing about it is it's akin to having taken this stance with race relations, and yeah, it's unbelievable.
Okay.
And sorry, the other thing, so comment on social media. The other thing is speak up in church. If you don't want to leave the church per se, if you wish that you could stay. But raise your hand, bear your testimony, be open and honest, because again, we're all in this together now. It's either, if you're homosexual, do not act on it in any way whatsoever. If you have opposing views to the church, do not express them in any way whatsoever. They started to open up that possibility, right? Earlier this year, Christofferson said that you could comment in social media without jeopardizing your membership status. But then he brought that in at the end of the interview last week as well, and reminded everyone that it's okay to have varying opinions, but not to advocate for them. In other words, it's not okay to have varying opinions. The implication is that you can't question the church on this policy. They didn't say that per se. And until they do, why not question it? Why not oppose it? And the other thing is, until they subject all of these families to disciplinary councils, they are still members of the church. So if you're gay and you wish that you could remain a member of the church, stay, face the fire, face the music. And if everybody does it, then that will have the greatest effect in my opinion.
So would you consider going to your local ward congregation and speaking up? Is that something that you would do?
I wouldn't be opposed to it. I didn't have plans of going back anytime soon is part of the issue. They certainly know where to find me. But that kind of response would be excellent. I mean, if everybody showed up to church this Sunday in support of all the homosexual members, that would be a great thing. And I think we're going to see a response in a variety of ways, and we already have. And again, the great thing is now that with the internet, the ability to organize and the ability to communicate is greater than ever before.
Sure. Okay. Well, I love not only your courage and your willingness to speak out, even as difficult as family and social ties might make it for you. I love it how thoughtful you've been about this policy, and picking it apart and analyzing it. I love how you're making a call for people to speak and to come out and to talk. So I've really loved this interview. Is there any before we wrap up? Is there any other point you want to make, or statement, or any other parting words you would want to leave with us?
I think we've gotten to pretty much everything I wanted to say for now. One thing I would say, just to everyone who's directly affected by this, all the gay members of the church, I'm sorry. It's a terrible thing that's happening, and the terribleness of it is only going to become more and more apparent over time, and that's why it's so important for people to speak up now. Probably the biggest motivating factor in me speaking out was thinking about all my nieces and nephews, and knowing that statistically there will be plenty of homosexual family members in my family if there aren't already. And to think that they're going to grow up in what is now, as of last week, one of the most discriminatory institutions in the country when it comes to this issue is a terrible thought. To grow up with their parents, the people that they love the most, their leaders in the church, telling them that they are morally inferior, inherently inferior. It's a terrible thought. That is my biggest motivating factor. And for anybody to be more concerned about their personal relationships over that, I think is not okay. And that's why we need to speak up.
How do you, if you do, resist? Some would kind of look at your mom's position and even your dad and say, well, they're loyal supporters of the church. They're even in higher levels of leadership for the church. They're part of this. How do you keep, or do you, from sort of feeling like your parents are behind this and part of it, or do you not see it that way?
Well, step one is to voice my opinion, which I'm trying to do now. That's step one. And also, no, but it's a valid point. As I mentioned, my mother is a great, great person. And that's why this is a difficult issue. It's because we're not suggesting that the church is filled with terrible people. It's not. But the fact that even good people and the collective involvement of good people could result in something like this is a huge problem. And the fact that anybody at the head of that organization would suggest that varying opinions, if they're advocated for, are subject to discipline, that is a very, very concerning thing. So I'm hoping that this will actually result in a very positive change in the church. And it may not, I may just get on here and rant and have my own membership terminated or something like that. But if I'm the only one to go down because of it, so be it. I cannot live with myself anymore without speaking up. But I think that there will be a positive outcome to this. I think there's light at the end of the tunnel, and that's something else for the gay members of the church to keep in mind. There is light at the end of the tunnel. And I think that everybody needs to recognize the actual historical relevance to our time right now. Think about our parents' generation. Think about the fact that they were the silent members in the 60s and the 70s. They were the people afraid of what might happen if they stood up. But imagine if they had. Imagine if the church was one of the biggest rallying voices for civil rights in that time period. Imagine the pride that we could speak with about our Mormon heritage if that had been the case, instead of desperately scrambling for any sort of half explanation as to what happened. Right? That's what we're dealing with now. Do we want to give to the next generation of members a prideful heritage and said, we stood up when it mattered most? We may not have done what we should have for the last 20 years, but when our own organization began to discriminate to that level, we stood up. That's the kind of heritage that we can give to the next generation. And we have to, or it'll never happen. That's what's at stake, and that's the opportunity that's in front of us. And I, for one, will not fall on the wrong side of this. Anyway, John, thank you so much for taking me on and listening. And I really do hope that others will consider doing the same, that might have similar connections in the church, because I have personal knowledge that they're out there. It goes up to the top. And again, if they've got to come after each one of us, so be it. But it's no longer acceptable to be silent.
Beautiful. Well, Eric Reeves, son of Melvin and Linda Reeves, good guy. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and feelings and your passion on Mormon stories. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, John, and thanks for everything you do.
Thanks. Listeners, please join us at mormonstories.org if you want to leave comments or questions. We'd love to see it there. Thanks to all those who support us financially. You make this possible. Eric, take care, and please stay in touch, will you?
Thank you. Will do, John.
Good luck with everything.
All right. Take care.
Take care.